I became interested in studying emotion in a very indirect way. When I was in graduate school, I was studying something completely different, self-esteem, and I noticed in experiment after experiment that some of my participants were able to articulate discrete feelings of emotion, very precise feelings. They were able to articulate these feelings very clearly and precisely. And other people would use the same words for emotions, but they would use words interchangeably like angry, sad, afraid, so that really what they were communicating was just a sense of discomfort or pain. And at the same time, I was training to be a clinician, and I noticed that in my clients, a very similar kind of thing, where some people would be very, very precise about their experiences, and other people, where anger and sadness and fear were very, very distinct experiences for them. And for other people, they seem to have much less distinctiveness, and they seem to feel generally bad or good, very pleasant or unpleasant, but nothing much more precise than that. And so I was very intrigued by this, and I wondered whether it was the case that some people were just being more, they could read off their internal states in a more precise fashion, and other people were reading off their internal states with less fidelity. This was my very naive idea at the time. And so this got me interested in the nature of emotion and trying to understand whether there was a way to objectively measure a person's emotional state separate from their experience of it, so that I could get a sense of who was more accurate in their in verbally representing their experiences. And what I discovered was that there is no objective criterion for measuring emotion. There's no objective measure that a scientist can take that will tell you whether somebody is angry or sad or afraid. There's nothing in the face or in the body or in the brain that can be measured. Yet perceivers, like you and I, have no trouble perceiving emotion in other people. And this to me seemed like a great mystery, a great paradox, and I became very interested in trying to solve this paradox. I think that you really have to look at the ebb and flow of interest in various topics in a historical context. So at the beginnings of psychology, at the dawn of psychology, when it emerged from the parent disciplines of physiology and philosophy, emotion was front and center as a topic of discussion. So, over 100 years ago, when people first started writing textbooks about psychology and started doing experiments, full scientific experiments in psychology, emotion was a very popular topic, which is, it's this element of life that, links us to other animals in the animal kingdom, and it also in some ways sets us apart from them. And so it's this really interesting topic of the mind. And it remained a central topic with a lot of interest over, several decades until the advent of behaviorism. So in psychology, around 1920s and the 1930s, there was this paradigm change. There was an emphasis away from anything that could not be directly measurable in a behavior. And psychology basically fell off the map as a topic. Emotion basically fell off the map as a topic of interest in psychology. And it remained that way for decades. And in the 1960s, there emerged in psychology what's called the cognitive revolution, where people became very interested in the mind and the workings of the mind as a way to predict behavior. And during that revolution, there was a lot of attention paid to what would be considered the cold processes of the mind, thinking and reasoning and memory. And only really as psychology started to emerge out of the cognitive revolution into the next phase, did people start to rediscover the idea like, hey, you know, humans have feelings and they have emotions and we perceive emotions in others, and that those perceptions are part of the everyday social discourse that marks human interaction. And so this is a topic that we should be interested in. So I would say really what's happened over the last couple of decades is that psychology has rediscovered emotion, in part because psychologists are now much more interested in studying mind-body relations. They've moved past the idea that the mind is this disembodied element. And so the focus on the body, I think, has really brought people back to this idea that emotion is central and important and needs to be understood. Emotion is a topic that spans disciplines. And so a journal like Emotion Review is really necessary because it allows scholars from different disciplines to talk to each other and to try to communicate their ideas in a way that can be used by other disciplines other than their own. So until the founding of this journal, there were pockets of research on emotion in various subdisciplines in psychology that don't really speak to each other, right? So in psychology itself, there are all these subdisciplines in developmental psychology, cognitive neuroscience, and cognitive psychology, and social psychology, clinical psychology, that don't necessarily actually have that much to do with each other. And then there were pockets of emotion research in other disciplines like linguistics and anthropology and sociology, and then also in more basic neuroscience and economics and so on and so forth. And these topics in these disciplines just proceeded without very much interaction with each other. So Emotion Review is a forum for everybody who's interested in emotion to read about cutting-edge, interesting topics and research. Hopefully that will aid cross-pollination and move the field forward. We have a number of very interesting themes that are going to be covered in the journal in upcoming issues. We have a special issue on consciousness and the experience of emotion from the standpoint of consciousness and studies on consciousness. We have a special issue on emotion regulation that we've arranged. We have a special issue on emotion and morality and moral judgment and moral reasoning that we are developing. Infant emotion, so do infants feel emotion in the way that adults feel emotion? We have a really interesting issue on the history of emotion research in various disciplines coming up as well. So we're trying to target sort of hot debates that exist in various disciplines around emotion, and then having scholars write targeted articles and comment on those articles to bring those debates to life and try to get some synthesis across the different disciplines. So the question of whether there is a particular discipline that we would like to see focus on emotion more is a difficult question to answer, because it's hard for me to think of any discipline that doesn't study emotion in one way or another. I think that the more practical application of scientific theories, scientific models would be very interesting. So can you really train people to perceive emotion better, more accurately, so that they can do better in security and international relations? Is it really possible to train small children to be more emotionally intelligent, and will this actually improve their social interaction or even their educational achievement? There's actually some suggestion that it will. But so I wouldn't really say there's a particular discipline that I would like to see focus more on emotion, because I think almost all of them do that come to mind. I think more a better focus would be trying to target specific topics and try to see how those topics can be applied in interesting and novel ways to solve the kinds of human problems that need solving. That to me would be a great step forward. The question of how the library plays a role in the formation of a journal or in any kind of scholarly activity is difficult to answer, because the library is central to all scholarly activity. It's like water for a human. You can't really, as a scholar, you can't really survive without a library. But I think that the role that the library has played for us is largely formative, in the sense that we have been able to read broadly in various areas that study emotion, various disciplines that study emotion. So from a research standpoint, it's given us ideas to focus topics on. It's allowed us really to define the boundaries of the journal very broadly. And then there are particular topics that we wouldn't necessarily have come up with for focus if it hadn't been for this library research. So, for example, the history issue is a really interesting issue. This idea of trying to trace ideas about emotion from a historical standpoint through the timeline of the last century or two across many different disciplines. This is something that couldn't have developed without intensive library research. The idea came from the discovery that in psychology there is this kind of unknown history of theoretical and empirical work on emotion that never gets cited anymore. So in my lab, we discovered by happenstance that there was this that there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of papers which have fallen off the citation trail. And there's a story that gets told about the history of emotion in psychology that appears in every introductory psychology textbook. It appears in every review paper that covers the topic. The idea that, and I mean, in some ways it's interesting. I basically gave you a version of this history in answering some of your previous questions, where, emotion was this topic of great interest at the beginning of psychology. Then it kind of fell off the map during the dark ages of behaviorism, only to be rediscovered, upon the fruits of the cognitive revolution. I mean, to some extent, that's actually not really the case. There was a tremendous number of papers published throughout the dark ages of behaviorism on emotion. It's just they never get cited. And they're important. And they're important to current day research in some ways. Some of the most modern cutting edge work is rediscovering the ideas that are in these papers that never get cited. And so we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to know whether there are other kinds of stories like this in other disciplines that study emotion? So I'm not sure that we would have even had the idea for this issue had it not been for the intensive library research that we have been doing, within the domain of psychology, and discovering this wonderful cache of old papers and books that nobody really cites or reads anymore. But after the issue comes out this year on history, I'm sure they will.